Western civilization was at stake, and we're going to fight until we win.
5 filmmakers wanted to respond as so many millions of men and women responded. They chose to serve.
Well, in 2014, a great book came out. It was called Five Came Back, the story of Hollywood in the Second World War. And what a story it was. This book, written by Mark Harris, uncovered the efforts of 5 major directors: Frank Capra, John Ford, John Huston, George Stevens, and William Wyler, and how at the outbreak of World War II, they got into uniform and were used by the U.S. Army to go out and use their filmmaking skills to make propaganda films for the government during the war. And that they did.
We had an enormous story to tell. The greatest heroes, the greatest villains on the world stage.
The story behind them and these films has now been told not only in the form of Mark Harris's exceptional book, but in a 3-part documentary series on Netflix, which will be available starting at the end of March. It is must-see TV, must-see movies. I cannot recommend this highly enough, and it's been put together in very entertaining fashion by Laurent Bouzereau, who's a director of documentary films, and by Mark Harris himself, who has written the script here. What it's done, though, is bring the book to life with film, because if ever a book should have been adapted to the screen, it's this one. We need to see this footage and these films, and these filmmakers have uncovered some amazing footage involving Hollywood, involving the war, and involving all these films, which many of which will be available to see in their entirety on Netflix when it begins running this 3-part documentary. What was very clever about this project is that they brought in 5 current contemporary directors to represent each one of the great Hollywood filmmakers who went to war. So we have Steven Spielberg talking about William Wyler, Paul Greengrass talking about John Ford, Guillermo del Toro talking about Frank Capra, Francis Ford Coppola, we have Lawrence Kasdan. It is really an inspired idea because these directors bring their own point of view to watching what their predecessors did here. And these movies all have their own personality as well. Who were they for? Well, it was obviously commissioned by the government as propaganda, some for people at home to see what was going on in World War II, others for the soldiers themselves. Capra oversaw a whole series of movies called Why We Fight. One of the best, though, came from William Wyler himself, and that was Memphis Belle, which has incredible footage and was considered a classic even to this day. Many of these films were nominated for and won Academy Awards in the documentary short categories. Some are truly extraordinary. The D-Day footage with both John Ford and George Stevens were assigned to go and shoot really the amazing battle during World War II is almost unwatchable, and in fact they said that much of the footage they had shot they couldn't use. People wouldn't be able to handle it. Of course, it's interesting to hear the story from the other end of these contemporary filmmakers that this film has, like Spielberg, who did Saving Private Ryan, among other World War II based films. And Schindler's List, of course, too, because in this film, George Stevens goes and does a film called Nazi Concentration Camps, set at Dachau, that is really extraordinary. All of these movies and this experience during the war changed these filmmakers, and that is taken up in part 3, too. What happened afterwards in the kinds of feature films that they went on to make. Frank Capra basically didn't want to deal with the war at all, made it perhaps his greatest film, even though it was initially a flop, as this film says, It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. George Stevens, though, who was known for comedy, went on to do basically serious dramas. He wasn't funny anymore. He didn't find the humor in things like he could before, even though he tried. One of his great films after the war in the late 50s was The Diary of Anne Frank, which certainly dealt with the Holocaust in a very human manner. John Ford went on to make a war movie, as he did several others, one called They Were Expendable, and there's a lot of insight from all of them in vintage footage that this movie has unearthed in addition to their great films. This is a must-see for anybody interested in World War II, interested in humanity, interested in great Hollywood stories and what happened. I think it's not been told in the way it's been told now, and it's definitely worth checking out. I say you have to see Five Came Back.